Okay, so I want to tell you a story that starts about 1,000 years ago by a huge, deep, beautiful river. And this river stretched for so many miles you wouldn't believe. At its widest point, it was about 3 miles wide, and so deep that no people have ever been to the bottom. And back around 1,000 years, it was forest and woodlands around there. There were small hamlets where people would live, and the people who lived in these hamlets in the forests and in the woodlands would talk about sightings of 2 strange mythical birds. These 2 birds were unlike any birds that have ever been seen before or since. They're about my height. At least in the beginning they were about my height. Now by all reports they are 24-foot wingspan and 3 times as high as me. But back then, when the sightings first began, they were reported to be about my height. They had minty blue feathers, almost like a peppermint colour. People couldn't understand whether they were eagles or some kind of huge cormorant, some kind of variation on one of those birds, but obviously huge, because no one could agree on what kind of bird they were. They were so unique looking. So imagine the strength of the eagle, but that kind of proud puffed out chest of the cormorant and a long beak. The birds would only be seen for a few seconds at a time and they'd fly off. Sometimes they'd be seen splashing in this deep river, like big wading birds just flapping their wings and splashing around, enjoying themselves. But mostly they would be seen frantically searching, because these 2 birds had never seen each other. But both of these birds at the same time knew that each other existed. And these were the only 2 birds of this kind in the world. Can you imagine how desperate they were to find each other? They would see a feather on the floor and know that it didn't belong to them by the scent or the size. They would sometimes in the night time, they would hear the cry, kind of like a deep the kind of sound that only they would make. They felt so desperately lonely. The only thing that brought them pleasure was the surrounding, the woodlands, the surroundings, the big deep river. It's like the love that they had for each other that they couldn't give to each other got transferred to the surroundings where they were. These beautiful deep forests of pine trees. But as time went on, people started to really talk about these birds and people wanted to see them. So this small area where just a few people lived, really, a few handfuls of people I should say, grew into a village because people started to arrive looking for the mythical birds. It grew from a village into a town with a port that became, at that time, and I'm talking early 20th century, late 19th century, so you can see how much time has gone by in this story at this point, turned into a really important port of the world and eventually just grew into a magnificent city. The bird sightings, ironically, had stopped. It was like the more people who arrived, the fewer people actually saw the birds, and we don't know why. But at this point, the city started to grow. This huge industrial smoky city of red brick houses that were squished together, 1 million people. It was a place of culture, of parties, all along this huge river. And this city is known to us now as Liverpool in England. But the strangest thing happened after the sighting of the birds disappeared. Around 1911, what was at that time the world's tallest building was built on the port of Liverpool. And at the top of this building, there were two towers, one on the side of the river and another one on the side facing the city. And alongside this amazing event that people all over the world were talking about, this skyscraper building, which nowadays is dwarfed. You know, some of the buildings out there in the world are far, far bigger than this. This is a baby-sized building now, but in 1911 it was huge. But something threatened the building as soon as it was built, and that was that the earth began to shake in Liverpool. And it was only happening in Liverpool. It wasn't happening anywhere else. This strange anxiety that the earth was feeling threatened the building, it threatened the houses, it threatened the whole city itself. And as people were starting to panic, and things were starting to crumble, and people were falling all over the place, just thinking, what's going on here? This is so strange. The most amazing thing happened. Our two birds reappear. One from the north of the city and one from the south. And at this moment, they both had exactly the same idea. Wherever they've been for hundreds of years, nobody knows. But what we do know is that at this precise moment in time, they both looked at the top of the tower. They felt the city crumbling. They felt like if it was just lasting for 5 more minutes, this whole city was going to crumble, and they had to do something about it, because even though they didn't have each other, they still hadn't found each other. They had their love of this area, this city, and the river, which we know now as the River Mersey, and they flew up in the sky towards the two towers, because they knew if they could put their whole mighty weight on top of each tower, it might just press down on these strange, inexplicable earthquakes and stop the city from crumbling and give it some stability. And that's exactly what they did. But guess what happened halfway through the air? It was amazing. The two birds saw each other for the first time. These birds are at least 1,000 years old, and they've been looking for each other pretty much all of that time, and they fly. And this all happened just for a couple of seconds. But as they pass each other in the air, for them, it was this golden moment that felt like a lifetime, a beautiful lifetime. And they just looked at each other with big, black, beady eyes, like, I can't believe this is happening. And we're both flying away from each other. The years of loneliness, of feeling like half of them was not there, could have ended. They had a second to make the decision. They could fly off together, or they could continue to fly to the top of the towers and save the city. And they flew to the top of the towers. The female landed on the tower that faces the River Mersey. The male flew and landed on the other tower with his back to the female, facing out to the city. And they landed in this strange pose like this, with their wings out, not daring to move a muscle, because the city did stop shaking and their plan worked. So half of them was relieved, but the other half of them was pining for the birds that was right behind them. Can you imagine? The love that you've been looking for all of your life just there, with their back to you, but you need to stay perfectly still and make this sacrifice for the place that you love. And that is exactly what the two birds did. They made that sacrifice at the top of those two towers in Liverpool. And you know, it might sound sad. It might sound like a tragic tale of these birds that gave up so much and are standing perfectly still and not moving an inch. But the reality is that they love it up there. Their home is the air itself. In the daytime, they see the sun come up, and they look up at the sky, whether it's cloudy or the sky is blue, which doesn't happen very often in Liverpool, to be fair. And they just enjoy seeing the clouds move, appreciating how at any given moment the cloud is never exactly the same cloud that was there the day before and never will be again. They enjoy the impermanence of the sky, of what's happening up there. In the night time, they watch the stars when they can see them, because the only thing they can move are their eyeballs, and they look out at different times of the year for the different constellations. They enjoy seeing the changes in the moon, because even though they can't move from this spot, everything around them is moving and changing, and they're so in tune with it that they feel that they are moving and changing also. When it snows, it's like this cosmic dust in the winter that just keeps them alive. It's so vibrant. They don't feel cold at all, they feel alive. They love to sit with snow all over them. And in the spring, when there's that freshness in the air, they just take in deep breaths and let them out again. In the summer, the heat of the sun burns down on them. They smile. If you look closely, you can see a small smile. And in the autumn, crispy leaves will be whisked up by that crazy Liverpool wind all around them. The birds are happy with this sacrifice, and the people love them in return as much as they love the city itself. Now, if you ever go to Liverpool, you can go to the city centre by the River Mersey, and you can look up and you can see the female, who's being called Bella affectionately by the people, looking over the river. And you might want to take a walk to the other side and see the male bird, who's been affectionately called BERTIE. I don't know who chose these names, by the way. You can see BERTIE, who watches out over the city, watches people getting into fights, drinking too much beer. That happens a lot in Liverpool. With a little smile on his face. He's a bit rough, BERTIE. He relates to it all. Because they're still there. The two birds, BERTIE and Bella, the Liver Birds, are still there to this day on top of the Liver building in the centre of the great city of Liverpool. And it's said to this day that if either bird takes off, and especially if the two birds fly off together, that the city will crumble and fall apart. And that is the story of the Liver Birds of Liverpool.